The first thing people noticed about Bumpy was not his reputation, or his name whispered in back rooms, or the way conversation softened when he entered. It was the stillness, a deliberate, unhurried calm that did not come from laziness or fear, but from a man who had learned early and often that the world was loud enough without him adding to it. In Harlem, where storefront radios shouted news and pain through open windows and arguments traveled faster than truth, Bumpy Johnson moved like someone who had already heard it all and chosen what was worth answering. He dressed simply but precisely. Shoes always clean, hat tilted just enough to suggest thought rather than style, eyes steady, never darting. Men who mistook that stillness for weakness corrected themselves quickly, usually without Bumpy ever raising his voice. There had been a time not long ago when the streets had tested him harder. Those memories sat behind his eyes, never spoken aloud, the way real lessons always did. Harlem in those days was a place that demanded choices. You could shout, or you could endure. You could react, or you could decide. Bumpy had decided. He learned early that dignity was not something the world handed you, especially not to a black man who knew how to read contracts, remember names, and speak carefully. Dignity had to be practiced daily, like prayer. And it had to be defended, not with rage, but with clarity. That clarity had carried him through rooms where men twice his size tried to dominate, with volume alone. It had carried him through negotiations where he was expected to nod and accept less because of the color of his skin. And it had carried him into a partnership, if that was the right word, with Dutch Schultz, a man who lived loudly, violently, and without apology. The newspapers liked to paint Dutch as a wild animal, all teeth and temper, a creature of instinct rather than thought. That image was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Dutch was ruthless, yes, but he was also observant. He understood leverage. He understood fear. And most importantly, he understood when another man was not afraid of him. Their relationship had never been friendship in the sentimental sense. It was an understanding built on necessity and mutual respect, forged in a city that rewarded neither innocence nor hesitation. They came from different worlds, walked different streets, but they shared a recognition. Survival required order, and order required agreements. When they spoke, it was not with warmth, but with precision. When they disagreed, it was without theatrics. That alone made their arrangement unusual, almost dangerous in its effectiveness. But this story is not about Dutch, not really. And it is not about the deals that kept money moving or territory stable. This story is about something quieter and far more fragile. It is about loyalty, and how easily it can be sold when a man forgets who he is trying to impress. The man who betrayed Bumpy Johnson had been with him long before the whispers began, before the polished shoes, before the careful silences. He had been there when Harlem still felt like a promise instead of a battleground, when survival looked less like strategy and more like endurance. They had eaten at the same tables, laughed at the same small jokes that meant nothing to anyone else, trusted each other with errands that mattered. In a world where trust was currency, that counted for something. Or at least it was supposed. To Bumpy had never called him his best friend out loud. He didn't believe in titles that tempted fate. But when trouble came, this man was there. When a message needed to be delivered without distortion, this man delivered it. When someone asked who could be trusted to keep his mouth shut, Bumpy's answer was consistent. That kind of trust is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, like dust on a shelf no one checks because they assume it will always be there. Harlem, however, had begun to change again. The city was tightening its grip, not on crime, but on who it decided deserved dignity. Police patrols grew more aggressive, more public in their humiliations. Black-owned businesses were inspected with a zeal that bordered on obsession, while others down the block were ignored entirely. Men were arrested not for what they did, but for how easily they could be blamed. The injustice was not subtle, and it was not accidental. It was a message, delivered daily, with batons and paperwork. Bumpy noticed these shifts the way a chess player notices a missing piece. He did not comment on them publicly, he adjusted. He listened more than he spoke. He reminded the men around him quietly that reaction was what the system expected. Thought was what it feared. This, too, made him dangerous in ways no headline could explain. The betrayal did not begin with a gun or a raised voice. It began with a conversation in a room Bumpy had never entered, between men who believed they were unseen. $30,000 does not sound like much now, but in those days it was enough to change a life, or at least convince a man that it could. Enough to buy silence, enough to buy lies, enough to buy the illusion of freedom from consequences. The offer was made casually, as if it were nothing more than business. A few names, a few routes, a few confirmations spoken into the wrong ears. No blood on the hands, they said. No violence required, just information, just cooperation. Just the smallest betrayal, repeated quietly until it grew teeth. What they did not understand was that the man they were buying was not desperate. He was tired. Tired of watching white men profit loudly while he was expected to stay grateful. Tired of being loyal in a world that rewarded treachery. Tired of standing beside someone who made dignity look effortless when his own felt constantly under review. The injustice did not excuse his choice, but it explained the crack where temptation slipped in. Bumpy sensed the change before he could name it. Trust, once disturbed, does not announce its departure. It leaves behind absences, pauses that last too long, answers that arrive too polished, eye contact that slips just a second too early. Bumpy noticed all of it, and he said nothing. He had learned that truth reveals itself faster when it believes it is safe. Around him, Harlem continued its rhythm. Music poured from clubs, laughter cut through the night air. Children ran between stoops, unaware of the negotiations that shaped their futures. Life, in all its contradiction, went on. That was the cruelest part. Injustice rarely stops the world. It simply forces some people to carry more of its weight. The first real test came not with violence, but with humiliation. A public stop. A search conducted slowly, deliberately, as an audience gathered. Bumpy stood still while hands rifled through his pockets, while eyes searched his face for anger they could justify. He offered none. When it was over, when the officers walked away without apology, he adjusted his coat and continued on his way. The silence that followed him was heavier than any insult. Men watched and learned. So did the ones who were listening elsewhere. That night, Bumpy sat alone longer than usual. Not in contemplation, but in confirmation. He understood now that something had shifted. The injustice was no longer random. It was informed. Someone had spoken, someone he had trusted. And that understanding did not bring anger. It brought clarity. He did not confront the man. He did not threaten. He did not accuse. He simply began to change the shape of conversations. The timing of movements, the weight of information shared. He created space for truth to reveal itself without force. This was the turning of the tide, though no one else could see it yet. What makes betrayal devastating is not the loss of advantage. It is the insult to memory. The rewriting of shared history is something disposable. Bumpy carried that insult. Quietly, the way he carried everything else. He would not allow it to make him loud. He would not allow it to make him cruel. If there was to be justice, it would come without spectacle. Somewhere across the city, the man who had sold him out counted money and convinced himself it meant safety. He mistook payment for protection. He mistook silence for approval. He did not yet understand the kind of man he had betrayed, or the kind of reckoning that comes not with fists, but with a few carefully chosen words spoken at the right moment. That moment had not yet arrived. But it was coming. And when it did, it would not sound like revenge. It would sound like truth. Bumpy Johnson rose from his chair, extinguished the light, and stepped back into the night. Harlem greeted him as it always had, with noise, with life, with contradiction. He walked through it unchanged, composed, quietly authoritative. A man still standing. A man still choosing restraint. A man who understood that justice, when done properly, does not rush. And somewhere behind him, unseen loyalty finished unraveling, thread by thread, preparing to collapse under the weight of its own lies. By the time betrayal shows its face, it has already learned how to whisper. It does not arrive dressed as an enemy. It comes wearing familiarity, carrying shared memories like forged papers, speaking in a voice you once trusted to tell the truth. That was the danger. Bumpy Johnson understood better than most. Open threats were easy to manage. Loud men revealed themselves quickly. But a quiet traitor, especially one who believed himself invisible, could poison an entire room before anyone realized the air had changed. The man who had sold him out did not wake up that morning believing he was a villain. That was how these things always began. He woke up believing he had finally made a smart decision, one that would put him ahead of the curve instead of forever standing in someone else's shadow. $30,000 sat heavy in his pocket, heavier than the guilt he refused to examine. He told himself it was compensation for years of being overlooked, for carrying loyalty like a burden instead of a benefit. He told himself Bumpy Johnson would understand. If he ever found out, because Bumpy Johnson always understood things. That belief was his first and most fatal mistake. What he did not see was the way Harlem had begun to move around him differently. Doors still opened. Conversations still happened. But the warmth was gone. He mistook restraint for ignorance, silence for blindness. He had not yet learned that when Bumpy Johnson grew quieter, it was never because he lacked information. It was because he was deciding what kind of man deserved to hear the truth. The pressure from outside forces intensified quickly, as it always did once power scented weakness. Police patrols became more surgical, more precise. Stops were no longer random, they were timed. Questions were asked that revealed knowledge no outsider should have possessed. The injustice was no longer blunt. It was informed, intentional, and cruel in its efficiency. Men were humiliated publicly, not to enforce the law, but to send a message. Someone was talking, and everyone would pay for it. Bumpy watched this unfold with the patience of a man who had survived worse. He did not rush to fix it. He did not lash out. He let the pattern complete itself, because patterns, once whole, could not be denied. He knew now that the betrayal was not a single act, but a series of small permissions, granted by a man who wanted to be important to people who would never respect him. At night, when Harlem softened into shadows and music, Bumpy sat with the weight of memory. He remembered when trust had been simpler, when loyalty was not constantly tested by money and fear. He remembered the first time that man had stood beside him, nervous but determined, asking nothing except the chance to prove himself. That memory hurt more than the betrayal itself. Betrayal was expected in this world. Memory made it personal. The man continued to feed information outward, emboldened by the absence of consequences. Each successful exchange made the next easier. Names became roots. Roots became schedules. Schedules became leverage. And with every word he sold, he lost something he could not buy back. He stopped meeting his own eyes in mirrors. He drank more. He laughed louder than necessary. These were not signs of confidence. They were the reflexes of a man trying to outrun himself. What he did not know was that Bumpy had already closed the circle. The decisive power Bumpy wielded was not force, but timing. He allowed the traitor to believe he was safe long enough to make himself undeniable. He allowed the system exploiting him to grow careless, confident in their purchase. And he allowed injustice to expose its own fingerprints. This was not mercy. It was strategy. shaped by a deep understanding of how men destroy themselves when they think they have won. The confrontation, when it came, did not happen in a dark alley or a crowded room. It happened in the most ordinary place imaginable, because Bumpy understood that spectacle cheapened truth. He invited the man to sit with him, just as they had done countless times before. No guards, no raised voices. Just two men in the space. Between them, heavy with everything unsaid, Bumpy did not accuse him. He did not list evidence. He did not raise his voice even once. He simply spoke about loyalty, about how rare it was, and how expensive it became once it was gone. He spoke about dignity, about how some men spent their entire lives chasing approval from people who would never see them as equals. And then he asked one question, quietly, calmly, with no anger in it at all. Was it worth it? The silence that followed was unbearable. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of recognition. In that moment, the man understood that everything he had done had been seen, measured, and judged not by a court, not by the police, but by the one person whose respect he could never replace. He tried to speak. He tried to justify. The words collapsed before they reached his mouth. Bumpy did not wait for an answer. He did not need one. The truth was already present, thick in the air. He stood, adjusted his coat, and delivered the only consequence that mattered. He removed the man from his circle completely. No violence, no public humiliation, no revenge. Just erasure. The kind that leaves a man alive but stripped of relevance, forced to live with the sound of his own choices. In Harlem, news traveled quickly. Not of what was said, but of what was done. Or rather, what was not done. Men noticed the absence. They noticed the sudden quiet around a name that used to carry weight. And they understood the message without it ever being spoken aloud. Betrayal did not lead to chaos. It led to isolation. And isolation, in that world, was the harshest sentence of all. The injustice did not disappear overnight. Systems rarely collapse that easily, but something shifted. The flow of information slowed. The precision vanished. Fear crept into the spaces where confidence had lived. And Bumpy Johnson remained exactly what he had always been: composed, intelligent, quietly authoritative. A man who proved, once again, that power did not need to shout to be heard. The man who had sold him out walked Harlem like a ghost after that. People saw him, but they did not see him. The money he had taken burned through his hands faster than he expected, and when it was gone, nothing remained to protect him from the weight of his own regret. He had traded something irreplaceable for something temporary, and the world made sure he understood the difference. Bumpy did not look back. He did not celebrate. He did not speak the man's name again. Justice to him was not about satisfaction. It was about balance. And balance had been restored, quietly, decisively, without a single blow struck. But the story was not over. Betrayal rarely travels alone. And as Harlem settled into a fragile calm, new eyes were watching, measuring Bumpy Johnson not as a man to be tested, but as a man to be respected or removed. The silence after betrayal is never empty. It is full of decisions waiting to be made. And Bumpy Johnson was already making his power does not announce itself when it is real. It does not arrive with threats or sirens or a man pounding his fist on a table. Real power waits. It watches. It lets others exhaust themselves, proving they have none. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone who had ever sat across from him. And by the time the city realized something had shifted, it was already too late to stop it. The absence left by the traitor had not gone unnoticed. In the weeks that followed, Harlem felt different. Not quieter exactly, but more cautious, as if the streets themselves were listening. Conversations lowered in pitch. Meetings ended sooner. Men who once moved with careless confidence now paused before speaking, measuring each word as though it might be weighed somewhere they could not see. That kind of fear did not come from violence. It came from uncertainty, and uncertainty was far more effective. The institutions that had grown accustomed to being informed from the inside began to stumble. Their raids missed their marks. Their questions revealed ignorance instead of authority. The sharp edge of their operations dulled, and with it came irritation. Irritation, when paired with entitlement, always turned into cruelty. The city answered confusion the only way it knew how, with pressure, with humiliation, with public displays meant to provoke a reaction that could be punished. They wanted Bumpy to lose his composure. They wanted anger. They wanted justification. They wanted him to become the caricature. They were comfortable destroying Dot, so they escalated. Community meeting was interrupted under the pretense of inspection. Papers were demanded that no one else was ever asked to produce. Men were searched slowly, deliberately, hands lingering too long, smiles too thin to be mistaken for professionalism. Women watched with clenched jaws. Children learned lessons no child should have to learn. It was injustice stripped of pretense, performed in daylight so no one could claim ignorance. Bumpy stood among them, still, silent, his face revealing nothing. He did not argue. He did not object. He let the moment exist exactly as it was, because he understood something the men in uniform did not. Every act of cruelty leaves a record, whether written down or not. And he was very good at keeping records. That night, he did not sleep much. Not because he was angry, but because he was deciding. Decisions of that weight demanded clarity, not emotion. He thought about the men who relied on him to remain steady. He thought about the ones who would suffer if he made the wrong move. And he thought about the kind of man he had promised himself he would never stop being. Even when the world made that promise expensive. The man who had betrayed him was unraveling elsewhere. Though Bumpy did not seek updates, he did not need. 2. Betrayal carried its own punishment. Isolation had done its work efficiently, leaving behind a shell that drifted through Harlem unnoticed, unheard. The poison of that betrayal, however, had not stayed contained. It had seeped into places that now demanded to be addressed, not with retribution, but with resolution. The opportunity came quietly. A meeting was requested, formal in tone, respectful in language, but heavy with implication. It was the kind of invitation that pretended to be mutual while assuming obedience. Bumpy accepted without comment. He did not bring an entourage. He did not arrive early. He walked in exactly on time alone, dressed with the same unremarkable precision he always favored. The room fell silent when he entered, not because he demanded it, but because his presence rearranged the air. The men across from him believed they were prepared. They had rehearsed their arguments. They had their documents, their authority, their practiced expressions of concern that masked threat. What they did not have was patience. They had grown used to men pleading, bargaining, reacting. Bumpy did none of these things. He listened. He nodded once or twice. He allowed them to speak until their confidence began to echo back at them, empty and overextended. When it was his turn, he did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not defend himself. He spoke instead about stability, about how communities survived when order was maintained with respect rather than force. He spoke about the cost of humiliation, not in moral terms, but in practical ones, about what happened when people stopped believing in the fairness of systems meant to govern them. He spoke calmly, precisely, choosing each word as though it might be his last. Then he stopped. The pause unsettled them more than anything he had said. Silence, when used correctly, forced men to confront themselves. Finally, one of them asked the question they had been circling all along. It was framed as a warning. It was meant to intimidate. "What happens," the man asked, "if we decide to make this difficult for you?" Bumpy did not answer immediately. He looked at the man as though considering him not as an adversary, but as a variable. Then he said something so simple it took a moment to land. Then you will have to explain why. The room shifted. Explanation was not something they were accustomed to providing. Authority was meant to be unquestioned. But Bumpy had done something dangerous. He had reframed the situation. He had placed the burden back where it belonged. He had made consequences visible. He stood to leave without waiting for permission. At the door, he turned just once, not to threaten, not to warn, but to clarify. "I am not your enemy," he said quietly. "But I will not help you become one." That was it. No bravado. No negotiation. Just a boundary drawn so cleanly it could not be misunderstood. In the days that followed, the pressure eased not because injustice had suddenly grown a conscience, but because it had encountered resistance it could not easily punish. Records existed now. Witnesses remembered. Patterns had been documented. The cruelty had lost its cover. And systems, when exposed, often retreated rather than risk examination. The true turning point, however, came not in public, but in private. Man who had betrayed Bumpy requested a meeting. It was the last thing Bumpy expected, and the first thing he understood. Desperation always came full circle. He agreed not out of forgiveness, but out of finality. They met in a quiet room, far from the eyes of Harlem, far from the noise of consequence. The man looked older than he should have, thinner, his confidence stripped down to something brittle and unconvincing. He spoke quickly at first, words tumbling over each other, apologies mixed with explanations no one had asked for. He spoke of fear, of money, of feeling invisible. He spoke until he ran out of breath, until the silence returned, heavy and unavoidable. Bumpy listened without interruption. When the man finally stopped, Bumpy leaned forward slightly, not in threat, but in attention. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "You didn't betray me because you were afraid," he said. "You betrayed yourself because you wanted to be seen by people who never intended to look at you." The man's eyes filled, not with hope, but with understanding. This was not forgiveness. This was truth. And truth, once spoken, could not be undone. Bumpy stood. He did not offer reconciliation. He did not offer punishment. He offered something far more final. "You're free now," he said. "From me, from this, from pretending you were loyal." It was not mercy. It was release. As Bumpy walked away, the weight he had carried since the first suspicion finally lifted. Not because justice had been loud, but because it had been exact. The city would continue to struggle. Injustice would not vanish, but something essential had been preserved. Dignity had survived. Authority had been exercised without cruelty. And a lesson had been delivered that no one present would forget. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is refuse to become what the world expects him to be. And Bumpy Johnson, once again, had chosen exactly that. There is a moment after. The storm passes when the world does not immediately return to its noise. It hesitates. It listens to itself. Harlem entered that moment slowly, like a man stepping out of a dark room into uncertain light. The pressure that had once wrapped itself around every corner did not disappear, but it loosened, just enough for people to breathe again. The streets still carried their usual rhythm. Music still drifted from open windows. Laughter still surfaced where it always had. But beneath it all was a new awareness. Something had been tested. Something had held. Bumpy Johnson walked through this quieter Harlem without acknowledging the change. He had learned long ago that acknowledging power was the quickest way to lose it. His posture was the same. His pace was the same. His face carried the same calm, thoughtful expression that had unnerved louder men for years. To the casual observer, nothing about him suggested victory. That was intentional. Victory, when worn openly, invited challenge. Resolution did not. The systems that had pushed hardest now recalibrated. They did not apologize. Institutions rarely did. But they adjusted their distance. They chose different targets. They found reasons to look elsewhere. This retreat did not come from fear of Bumpy Johnson the man, but from fear of Bumpy Johnson the example, a man who did not shout, a man who did not retaliate, a man who understood that injustice thrived on reaction, and that denying it, that fuel was its most effective. Undoing, the men who worked beside him noticed the difference. They spoke of it quietly, in fragments, in half-finished sentences that carried more weight than declarations ever could. They understood that what had saved them was not force, but restraint, not secrecy, but patience, not vengeance, but clarity. In a world that demanded they become hard to survive, Bumpy had shown them how to remain whole instead. The man who had betrayed him faded completely from the narrative. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation witnessed by others. He lived, which was punishment enough. He watched Harlem continue without him, felt the absence of relevance settle into his bones. The money that had once seemed like salvation had long since vanished, leaving behind the knowledge that some things, once sold, could never be repurchased. His greatest sentence was memory. Every laugh he heard reminded him of rooms he would never enter again. Every moment of quiet forced him to sit with the truth he could no longer escape. Bumpy did not think of him often. Forgiveness was not something he performed publicly, and forgetting was not something he allowed himself. He understood that remembering was a form of discipline. It reminded him why restraint mattered. Why loyalty, once broken, changed not just relationships but entire communities. There came a night when the weight of it all finally settled. No meeting, no crisis. Just a simple gathering, a small room filled with familiar faces, men and women who had endured quietly and paid attention carefully. They did not speak of the past directly. They spoke of futures, of children, of businesses, of what it meant to build something that could not be so easily dismantled by cruelty or greed. At one point, the room fell silent, not awkwardly, but naturally. Someone looked at Bumpy, expecting words. He did not rush to provide them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, unadorned. "Power," he said, "is not what you can take. It's what you don't have to." No one applauded, no one needed to. The truth of it sat heavy and complete. As the gathering ended, and people filtered back into the night, Bumpy remained behind for a moment, alone with his thoughts. He thought about the younger version of himself, the boy who had learned early that the world did not extend grace evenly. He thought about how easy it would have been, so many times, to let anger decide for him, to let humiliation harden into something corrosive. And he felt quietly the satisfaction of knowing he had chosen differently. That choice had not made him untouchable. It had not made injustice disappear. But it had preserved something far more valuable than dominance. It had preserved dignity. His own and that of the people who looked to him, not for permission to be cruel, but for proof that strength could exist without brutality. In the days that followed, life continued. That was the true resolution. No headlines, no monuments. Just continuity. Children walking to school without fear. Storefronts opening on time. Conversations happening without whispers attached. These were small victories, invisible to those who expected justice to announce itself loudly, but unmistakable to those who had lived under its absence. Bumpy Johnson did not seek legacy. He did not believe in carving his name into history at the expense of peace. He believed in moments, in decisions made quietly, correctly, and without witnesses. He believed that the truest measure of a man was not how much power he could display, but how much restraint he could sustain when power was offered to him cheaply. One evening, as the sun dipped low and Harlem softened into golden shadow, Bumpy stood at a corner and watched the city breathe. He saw the movement, the life, the fragile balance holding steady for now. He knew it would not last forever. Nothing ever did. But he also knew that when the next test came, and it always did, there would be a precedent, a memory of how one man had chosen silence over savagery, dignity over destruction, He adjusted his hat, turned, and walked on Dot behind him. The city did not erupt into applause or acknowledgement. It simply continued. And that, more than anything else, was the victory, because sometimes justice does not look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like survival with your soul intact.